So your storytelling side definitely comes out in this book. What were some of your favorite stories to share?
Well, I think probably, the one that I think people are stunned by is the one in which I tell my grandmother to go to hell when I'm 4 years old. That people seem to get a kick out of that. And some of the things that there's some funny things in there. My mother, one of the most dignified people I've ever met, and yet there's a scene in there where I pull a prank on my mother, and to get back at me, we're having dinner. To get back at me, I sit down, I go to take a bite out of the little creamed onions that are sitting on my plate, and her glass eye is sitting there in the onions. So moments like that are kind of funny to me. I think the hardest chapter to write, really, the one that I kept going back to, uh, was the chapter. It's really a chapter on forgiveness, or not, and that's the chapter. It's called Love in INN, which was the weird little cult I was part of up in New York many years ago. And so that story where I talk about this church official who I call in the book, I call him Rock. Um, but I think that story was probably the hardest to tell. I think those are the hard things in lives, are the unresolved things we have, wanting closure, in that case, wanting closure with someone who I felt like was extremely damaging to me, and realizing, you can't really get closure unless someone wants to give it to you. And I think that's a real common thing. So that was the hardest chapter.
Yeah.
Certainly, writing about my marriage and its demise, I really wanted to be honoring of my ex-wife, who's a phenomenal person. I mean, she's great, and so I hope that readers, in fact, I hope that reading it, I hope readers see see the affection and see the honor that I'm trying to pay in the midst of telling a story that doesn't have the happiest of endings. Although if that's the end, if divorce is the end, which in our case it's not the end of the relationship, thankfully. Um, and I think talking about new love, I think I had to do that very carefully because I really want to keep that sacred. I don't want to give details of something so good. To me, it's like, go find your own good stuff. So I just, I want to be very careful with that. And again, writing, I wanted to honor the people I wrote about. I don't talk a lot about my own children in there, although there's a lot to talk of. I I kind of wanted them to maybe be a little older and have a little more sense of control about the things that I talk about when it comes to them. Got two daughters, and uh, just really wanted to honor them. But I'm trying to think of something else I really wanted to tell. I mean, it was fun talking about my touring with Emmylou Harris and playing with the musicians I play with. Some of my best friends in the world. But it's fun talking about that stuff and hoping you don't sound like a name dropper, but also acknowledging this is my life. This
Right,
is
right.
what I've been doing for the last many years. Um, how about you? Was there any particular story you were hoping I would mention?
I mean, there wasn't anything I was hoping you would mention. I mean, personally, I absolutely loved some of the ones that you mentioned. The glass eye thing was fantastic. That was one of my favorites. Um, and I think, well, I've been to Radnor Lake, so I love the Radnor Lake chapter as well. Um, and Love In, that was definitely one of the most complex stories. There were many complex stories, but I think that was one that definitely stood out.
Yeah,
So,
I went back. I mean, I'm glad you even mentioned that one because that's probably the one that worries me the most. I mean, this is my first book. As confident as I am in what I do as a musician, you know, and as a songwriter, and really as a writer, as confident as I am in that, it is, you know, there is, that's probably the one chapter where I'm thinking, I hope this lands right. I hope this chapter lands right. And that's kind of the only way I can even say it. Because when you're talking about, like, I feel even when I'm talking about my grandmother, who is one of the other villains in the book, you know, Rock is certainly like he's the big villain, uh, which is, you know, I think we all have villains in our lives, but a lot of times we're able to reach out and figure out how we've been villains in their lives and find closure, find forgiveness, even have great relationships with people who we've, you know, been at odds with. But Rock would not be that person. My grandmother, the reason it was easy to lay those stories out there was because of the funny, almost miraculous closure I was able to find. It had nothing to do with her. You know, she never gave me, she she was never able to confess that she was trouble, but I had, you know, I felt like Providence gave me an experience at her funeral and I don't think I saw it at the funeral, but it gave me an experience to let go with, and but you know, I'll have to say that religious people, who Rock certainly represents those religious tyrants in everybody's lives, I'm going to cut them a whole lot less slack, you know, to be honest with you. I just feel like the world is messed up in a lot of ways because of a lot of religious guys who think they know how things ought to be, and are going to make you kowtow to it. So anyway, no regrets. Who knows where it'll go? But you know, but I'm glad I changed his name because, you know, maybe he's a different guy now, and maybe his kids would feel bad if they read his name, which was Steve Schwartz. No, I'm just kidding. It wasn't that. That was funny. You got to leave that in because that was funny. Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting stuff. That's good. Okay. Well, yeah. So I'm trying, but you know, I love talking about my grandmother because she is a character, and then my mother. Obviously, my mom is intriguing. I hope I've honored her. I'm sure she wouldn't want to read the thing. I think you know, she wouldn't deal well with it. But you know, she's a super complex person. And then, of course, talking about my father, who, you know, I'm probably prejudiced for. You know, I don't, you know, I'm not sure what, you know, I'm not sure what his flaws were because he was so great. But I loved writing about Dad. I have to say I loved, but it was easier to write about the more complex stuff. It was easier to write about my tyrannical grandmother. It was easier to write about my demanding mom than to write about my loving dad. You know, I really had, and that's where the editing process of this book was interesting because Adrienne Ingram, my editor, who, you know, she didn't change one word I wrote, which I was really happy about. But what she did do was say, I wish you'd write more, like in that case, I wish you'd write more about your father. Tell me this, tell me that. And that was a great help. But it is funny, I gave a copy of The Galley to someone I had not seen probably in about 40 years, somebody I went to grade school with and Sunday school. And this woman's mother, who's now deceased, her mom and my mom were best friends. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because so I gave her a copy of The Galley, and she and we're not close friends. We're just kids who grew up together, have a lot of similar history. But it was funny because I gave her the book, and she wrote back and said, you know, your mother was my mentor. Your mom is the reason I'm a church organist. And when I was in like sixth grade, your mother was teaching me Lutheran hymns and all this. This woman's now a Lutheran minister. And so that was interesting to read. And her memories of my father they weren't necessarily negative, but they weren't warm. And that really surprised me. So that's again the filter of experience and the filter of what we what we want to see, what we don't want to see, what we can't stand to see. It changes with everyone. But so I that was interesting to get her take on it.
Right. It's all these different encounters that you have. It just depends on your perspective, I guess.
Yeah.